Welcome back. U.S. Attorney John Durham's investigation into the origins of the Russia probe continues as we learn new information about efforts to unmask individuals during the final weeks of the Obama administration. I asked Attorney General William Barr about the status of the investigation, whether there is criminal misconduct. We're waiting on John Durham's investigation, a criminal investigation. What bearing does the election have on that? I haven't heard any Democrats raise any upset over the fact that wiretapping of an American citizen was illegal. An FBI agent changed evidence, changed a document, a whole host of issues. So am I to believe that if we don't get the results of the John Durham investigation before the election and Donald Trump loses, we won't hear another word about this?
Well, first, I agree with you. It's been stunning that all we've gotten from the mainstream media is sort of bovine silence in the face of the complete collapse of the so-called Russiagate scandal, which they did all they could to sensationalize and drive. And it's like not even a whoops, they just on to the next false scandal. So that has been surprising to me, that people aren't concerned about civil liberties and in the integrity of our governmental process. In terms of the future of Durham's investigation, he's pressing ahead as hard as he can, and I expect that, we will have some developments, hopefully before the end of the summer. But as I've said, his investigation will continue. It's not going to stop because of the election. What happens after the election may depend on who wins the election.
Has he been delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic?
There has been delay because of the pandemic. Yes, there has.
An inability to interview people?
Yes. Not an inability, but a distinct slowing down of that process.
Because you can't gather a grand jury?
Well, I don't want to suggest there has been or is a grand jury, but it is a fact that there have not been grand juries in virtually all districts for a long period of time, and also people have been reluctant to travel for interviews and things like that. So it has slowed things down, but he's been working where he can on other matters that aren't affected by the pandemic, but there has been an effect.
A source said to me a couple of years ago, speaking of the Russia collusion story, that this was the closest the United States ever came to a coup to take down a president since the assassination of Lincoln. Is that an appropriate statement?
In this sense, I think it is the closest we have come to an organized effort to push a president out of office.
And it continues.
But I'm not reaching a judgment as to what the motivations there were.
Can you tell us anything about how this all started? This is not just an American citizen. This was a man running for president, and this was a person who got elected to become the president. And the FBI thought it was a good idea to launch an investigation into Donald Trump and potential collusion. Why?
I guess I don't want to talk about that. Some of it may become evident, as the more facts are disclosed. But I think there's probably a range of motives for different people.
But is there any evidence that, in fact, it was appropriate to launch an investigation other than a conversation in a bar? I know that George Papadopoulos had a conversation in a bar.
That is the official version of what happened. That comment in a London wine bar was what the basis really was for going forward. And I've said that I thought that was a very slender reed to get law enforcement and intelligence agencies involved in investigating the campaign of one's political opponent.
Lindsey Graham told us that 4 FBI case agents talked to the Russian subsource. In other words, the person who compiled some of the information in the dossier. And that subsource told those agents that it was just bar talk, that it wasn't true, that we didn't really buy it anyway. Did those case agents tell their superiors that?
Again, I don't want to get into the details because those are the kinds of things we're looking at, but that whole vignette is laid out to some extent in the IG's report, that in January 2017 and in March 2017, they talked to the primary subsource, who was the sole conduit for this information that made up the dossier. And as I've said, the dossier pretty much collapsed at that point, and yet they continued to use it as a basis for pursuing this counterintelligence investigation.
So does it sound like Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe knew that the dossier had collapsed in January of 2017?
I don't want to discuss that aspect of it.
Okay. What about the leaks? Senator Ron Johnson is investigating the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and he told us that in the first 126 days, there were 125 leaks. And compare that to Obama's 126 days, there were 8 leaks. Bush, there were 9 leaks. What's the situation with the leak investigation? Do you expect that we will see indictments for those who leaked classified information? Is that a felony?
Leaking national defense information and unauthorized disclosure of that information is a felony. I have tried to strengthen our efforts to investigate leaks. They're very difficult to investigate, especially where a lot of people had access to the information. And because at the end of the day, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a particular person who did it, and also because the news organizations don't cooperate in those investigations, obviously. But we are pursuing leaks aggressively where we think there's a realistic possibility that we could find out who it is. So we have a lot of leak investigations underway. And if we get the evidence that's necessary, we'll prosecute them.
So I know that the FBI said that they started a counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign in July of 2016. But there's a lot of activity before that. And in April of 2016, people arranged for George Papadopoulos to meet with Joseph Mifsud. Has Joseph Mifsud worked with Western intelligence before?
No, I can't get into that.
I mean, I asked because we talked about that Barr conversation between Papadopoulos and someone else, and you have to wonder, was that conversation organic, or was that conversation and the content of what Papadopoulos said planted on him?
Yeah, I understand, why it is important to try to determine whether there was any activity before July, before the Papadopoulos wine bar conversation. I understand that, and so people are looking at that. It's significant also that the dossier was initiated before July.
Rick Grinnell calls the transition period key. What can you tell us about the transition period that we need to understand better?
Well, it depends on what the motivations were and why they were looking at it, but it is, I would say it's unusual for an outgoing administration, high-level officials, to be unmasking very much in the days they're preparing to leave office. It makes you wonder what they were doing.
How do these Senate testimonies help the DOJ?
Well, I mean, they're not, the DOJ and Congress have separate roles to play. DOJ, we are looking at whether or not there's been any criminal activity and investigating, and I think Congress is interested in sort of finding out what happened and disclosing it to the public. So there are different functions that are being performed. I don't think that, those are conducted to help the DOJ. We do our own investigations.
Coming up, AG Barr reacts to John Bolton, the former national security advisor, and the release of his memoir.